Welcome to part 3, writing your story. To start thinking like a storyteller, I want to introduce you to the idea that all stories have a shape. And you might have heard of the idea of a story arc, where we start the story in a point of low tension once upon a time, nothing's happened yet. In the middle part of the story, we go on a high dramatic tension journey where there's challenges and difficulties. And at the end, we have a nice resolution where all the storylines get tied up at the end and everyone lives happily ever after. So there immediately we have a 3-part structure of beginning, middle and end, where we have low tension at the beginning, going to high dramatic tension in the middle, ending with low dramatic tension. And we can start modelling our stories in this 3-part story structure and creating story arcs of our own. The purpose of the beginning part of our stories is to give our audience context, and that's a low dramatic tension introduction. In the middle part, we want to introduce them to a question or a problem, and that introduces high dramatic tension. And at the end, we want to resolve that tension with a conclusion. So start thinking in 3 parts: beginning, middle, and end, context, question, answer. You'll find in the worksheet an example of how to start thinking and writing in this way. A 3-part story that's a very short introduction to your research that follows the following format. Part 1. What do we need to know? What's the context? Part 2, what's the problem that you were trying to solve? And part 3, how are you solving it? You'll find more examples of these simple 3-part stories in the accompanying notes, and you'll also find a template in the worksheet to get going with. What you've just written is a really good example of an introduction to your research. But that 3rd point, so here's what I'm doing about it, we know takes sometimes many years worth of work. So how do we then go on to tell a longer story that encompasses all of that time and all of those findings? I'm now going to introduce you to the idea of writing a longer story, and we're going to keep with this 3-part structure, beginning, middle and end. And I'm first going to introduce you to the format, the template of this story, with a familiar story, which is Finding Nemo. So here's the story of Finding Nemo. Once upon a time, there was a dad fish called Marlin and his son Nemo, and they lived in this beautiful tropical reef somewhere near Australia. Every day, Marlin the dad would take Nemo to school, and they lived in this wonderful idyllic community. The characters in the story are Marlin, the dad, and Nemo, the son. The world of the story is the fact that they start off in this beautiful tropical reef where they live. The stakes are that it's just the 2 of them in their family, Nemo and Marlin. One day, Nemo gets taken away by a scuba diver to go and live in a dentist's office in Sydney. That's our inciting incident, and that causes the rest of the story to happen, which is Marlin going to find Nemo. So off he swims on his journey, and along the way he meets conflict and challenges like sharks and jellyfish. He also meets Dory, his friend, who's a sort of friendly antagonist character. Eventually, they find Nemo, but on the way home, they have to go through this final test. The final test in the story is that they find Nemo, but on the way home, Dory gets caught up by a fishing net, and Nemo has to swim into temporary danger in order to go and save her, which of course he does, and they all return home to go and live in the reef happily ever after. What can we notice about this archetypal story arc? Well, it's got that sort of shape, but there's a few other things I want to point out to you. The first is that change occurs in this story, and the change is in Marlin, the protagonist. He learns to become less controlling and less overbearing on Nemo. The second thing is that it's a linear journey, and these sorts of archetypal stories often are physical linear journeys, but for our purposes we can also think of it as a kind of metaphorical journey of discovery or learning in the protagonist. And finally, his journey isn't easy. He encounters challenges and difficulties along the way. It's quite a long journey that he has to go on. It's not simple for him to just go and find Nemo. And we can take lessons from this template to apply it to communicating our research. Here's how to apply that story template to a research story. At the start of your research story, you need to tell us what are the important things about the world in which the research takes place. What's the context that we need to know in order to appreciate the story that you're about to tell us? We also need to meet you. the character, the researcher, and also be introduced to the other important characters that influence the story, the journey that you go on. When you set out the context for us, it can be really useful for us to understand, what do you as the researcher, or what does the world have to gain or lose from the success of this work? In other words, what's your motivation for doing it? Having got that context, we now need to understand, what was the problem that you were trying to solve? In other words, can you tell us your research question? After your research question, of course, you then go off on your journey. This is one that probably involves doing a number of experiments or a number of studies. When you communicate this journey that you're going on in your research, it's really important to link it together with a coherent narrative. So don't just give us a list of the experiments that you've done, but tell us, why did the first one come first? And then what was the reason for doing the second one? And how did that link on to the third, etc.? It's really useful for us to be able to follow your thought process through that journey, to see the linear and stepwise nature of the argument that you're building. Just like it wasn't easy for Marlin to find Nemo, we know that the reality of research is that it usually isn't easy or straightforward either. So in your story, given the journey that you went on, can you identify for us any conflict at play to tell us a dramatic story? Were there any difficulties or hurdles that you had to overcome? And how did you overcome those? This is a really crucial aspect of showing us you as a researcher and your strengths in how you overcome those challenges. Once you've been on this journey of discovery, we have the moment of the final test, a kind of conclusion, if you like. And in Finding Nemo, when Marlin goes through his final test, he has to put into practice everything that he's learned in the middle part of the story on his journey to do something new and to show how his character has changed. For our purposes, what this means is taking all the information that we found in our journey of research and doing something or saying something new with it. So a conclusion that draws all of those experiments together and says something new. And then finally, we have our resolution. This should aim to answer the research question that we set out to find in the first place. So, can Marlin find Nemo? Yes, he can, and they all live happily ever after. So your research question, can we discover this, or what if we did this? The conclusion, the resolution needs to be, yeah, we can partially answer that question, but there's still a bit more work to go. Or, no, actually, that was the wrong question, and here's why, and here's what we're going to do next. We know that the process of research isn't everyone lived happily ever after, but to resolve a nice research story means to refer back to the question that you were trying to answer and evaluating to what extent you've been able to answer it. In the accompanying information, you can find lots of examples of how to apply this to papers, presentations, grant proposals, career stories, to show how this template can be a really universal one to help you start communicating your research as a story. When I first started applying this model to research communication, I found that my audience were more engaged with what I was telling them, and I was also able to stand out from the crowd. What this gives you, I think, is firstly a really nice template to get rid of the blank page thing of when you're trying to write a presentation or writing a paper. It also gives you a nice narrative flow, so you've got an idea of why one thing leads to the next thing, so the audience kind of stay engaged and stay involved with you. It helps you to draw out maybe different information than you would otherwise have. For example, with the conflict, we might not think of that as being important in research, but it is important in stories. So identifying those sorts of things is really helpful. And it also helps to inform thinking of audiences in different ways that you'll do it. For example, with some audiences, you might need to spend loads more time world building because they're not specialist in your area. Or for others, you might want to emphasize the journey that you went on because they'll be more interested in the methods that you did. So thinking like a storyteller means understanding all these different tools that you have at your disposal and how you can create engaging story arcs that will keep your audience listening and help them remember you afterwards. So, in summary, thinking like a storyteller means considering your aims and your audience and making a plan starting from those principles. It means thinking in a 3-part story structure way. What's the context, what's the question, and what's the answer? It means understanding where dramatic tension is at all times in order to create a nice arc shape for your story. It means inviting us into the world of your research and acknowledging that you are the main character of your story. It means keeping the linear narrative going throughout your story and including extra elements like what was at stake and where's the conflict in order to make it dramatic for your audience. And finally, resolving it for us in a satisfying way that refers back to your question that you were trying to answer. You can find loads more examples and applications in the accompanying materials to these videos, and you can reuse the worksheet as many times as you want for any future stories that you have to tell. I'll look forward to meeting you to talk about your stories at a future session, or if you don't have one booked in, get in touch with me on the Storyology website to see how I can help you tell your research stories better.